You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome, everyone. Before we welcome our first guest today for check-in, we, Geoff, Mike, and myself wanted to thank everyone for the response to the first 4 episodes of Hotel Pacifico, and thank our most recent visitor, John Horgan, who I hear is still sampling some of the German beers at the hotel bar.
He's heavy in the Bavaria section, I think, right now in our bar.
Delicious. Just so you know, normally we'll be dropping episodes on Wednesdays. Occasionally we'll have a bonus episode like we did with Premier Horgan last week, but generally will be your midweek fix of BC politics.
Yeah, and we're having a lot of fun with it, and we're glad to hear from our listeners too, who are posting reviews and on social media or to the podcast site itself. And we had a really good one this week from McDuff, the dog, who is seen frequenting the Rockland area of Victoria. And McDuff said, great conversation. We enjoyed it very much indeed. I'm assuming he might be referring to his Vice Regal dog walker, but can't know that for sure. But thank you, McDuff. We appreciate it. You are definitely barking up the right tree.
Is there a pun quotient we're trying to reach today? Yeah.
Reach mute button, dad jokes. But we also thank Globe Mail for paying attention too. They had a nice little plug on our most recent episode as well. So yeah, we're having fun. Let's get into it today.
Yeah, and I'm excited today because in advance of the BC NDP Convention this weekend, checking in at Hotel Pacifico today is Raj Sihota, who is VP at 360 Strategies and a former executive director of the BC NDP. She was a key architect of the 2017 and 2020 BC NDP election campaigns and served on Premier Horgan's transition teams in both those election cycles. Raj, I bet it is a happy accident of the fact that you're not planning or involved in the planning of this particular convention that we get to see you at Hotel Pacifico this week.
Yes, and I am so pleased to be here. I'm so delighted about what you, Mike, and Geoff are doing here, Kate. I think this space to talk about British Columbia and our unique space here in the country, and our politics are just a little bit different. So I just really appreciate that you are going to tune us into local personalities that really do make our political scene here. Well, I like to think it's unique in the country in terms of what we do here and how we work together or not work together. And I just think it's just an amazing space. And it's so nice to see people that I work with on both sides of the house being reflected here in this podcast. So I really appreciate it. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate talking to people like yourself who've played an important role behind the scenes to gain your insights. And I'm kind of interested in your story, Raj. I understand you grew up in Kamloops. Is that right? Or are you formative years? Or
absolutely.
Is there a Kamloops backstory?
Yeah.
Well, you know, everything leads back to Kamloops in my life. I think Geoff and John Horgan and Bob Dewar would say that because, you know, I think where you grow up is just, it's so much a part of who you become in British Columbia. And I just grew up at a time in Kamloops and in the 70s, 80s, born and raised in Kamloops. And I spent a part of my life in the North Thompson Valley before I started elementary school. So very idyllic sort of, you know, little hobby farm. My dad worked for Weyerhaeuser. And I grew up in this elementary school in this neighborhood that was just quite incredible. Peter Millibar was one of the people I grew up with in my neighborhood. Marcella Bernardo, who's a political reporter.
Peter Millibar, probably a bit of a troublemaker, I'm thinking.
What was he like in school? Yeah.
Well, I think when you talk to people who grew up with us, I think people would say that Peter and I haven't really changed that much. And at the drop of a hat, we could probably still get into an argument. But I mean, I was so proud in 2017. I was working on transition and I ran into Peter at the lobby of the Hotel Grand Pacific. And I was just so proud of him. It was just sort of post-pandemic and I ended up giving him a big hug. Because, you know, it's an incredible time to grow up like that. And then you see people and the stuff that you were engaged in and the teachers who were encouraging you to have certain conversations and debates and how that shaped and formed us. And so I always look at my elementary school class, you know, as a real microcosm of British Columbia. And I've always taken that with me, always.
So were you literally in the same class in elementary school?
Peter, I think he's a year older than me, but we had split classes. It wasn't a huge elementary school. So we shared a lot of classes, I think in grade 4, 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7. Yeah.
Well, Peter might have been held back, but Just kidding, Peter. Just kidding.
I do
But
believe I beat him as school president
Okay.
when
Oh,
I
I'm
was in
sure he
grade
was.
six.
We're going to have
Well,
Peter Millibar on to
well, I'll have to have a rebuttal
defend his
episode now.
elementary
Yeah.
school record. Yeah.
And for those who don't know, Peter Millibar is the MLA for Kamloops, North Thompson area. But anyways, you got into politics somehow. Was that at a young age or university, or what led you
How'd that happen?
down that path?
So, I wasn't raised a New Democrat. My father, growing up, voted Socrat. I mean, I think, you and Bob, Mike, were talking about the 86 campaign. Well, I was still in junior high in 86, but I'm pretty sure we had a Bud Smith sign on the front lawn.
Okay.
So it wasn't so much partisan politics, but there was a milieu of politics, certainly in Kamloops. And so you're always a part of it. And, I remember my father canvassing for Bud Smith. I remember being very excited as a child, being able to go on some of those canvassing trips. And, I dabbled in youth parliament growing up. And, when you got to university and your politics and, the Socreds in the late 80s wasn't the best time to be a Socred. I think if you were trying to be engaged in politics. So, as you're getting older and as you're heading to university, your interests change. You start looking at what you want to do in politics. And I think you get to university and you meet a whole bunch of people that are kind of like you from all over the place, right? And then you get active in club politics and, model parliament. And there are people who took all that stuff far more seriously than I did. But I certainly dabbled in it, and I've made lifelong friendships, New Democrats and, with folks in the BC United Party, because if you're interested at a certain time when you're growing up in BC like that, there were opportunities to get really involved. And, there used to be a week, and I think they still do it, right? BC Youth Parliament, where you go to Victoria and you sit in the legislature and, you play the role of the leader of the opposition and the premier, and you have caucuses and you have debates. And being around the buildings and being inspired by that. And even today, when I'm in the buildings and I see Keith Baldry, walking students through, right? I mean, that warms my heart. It makes me smile because somewhere in there are a bunch of kids, some of them maybe, who will be inspired about getting involved and making a contribution. And I think I try to do that. I try to bring people along and mentor them into what is possible here.
I'm just noting a key difference between you and me is that you went to BC Youth Parliament, which is typically I think, first weekend in January. And that's where all the nice kids go and they perform the role of opposition and government. The following week is University Model Parliament, is where all the partisan kids go, and they have lots of drunken parties and every few years get evicted from the hotel they stay in because they're so noisy. So I went the latter route. Anyway, you obviously did it the principled way, and may have learned something, whereas I was off with Adrian Dix and others who were in the University Model Parliament. Anyways.
Which is to say that there were, Adrian and John, people who are really active in politics, right? They were working on the Hill, when I was doing all of this, but, you met them later and you sort of understood that piece of it. And I really enjoyed the discussion that you and John had the other day about why is it that we don't have more people involved in federal politics out of British Columbia, right? And I think a lot of us dabble. I certainly spent a lot of time working for Jack Layton. I was so excited about the Layton project, but by and large, it's BC politics that gets me out of bed most days,
Well, I want to actually also connect this to a conversation we had with Kareem Alam, right, a few weeks back. And Kareem's career in BC politics goes back to the early aughts. And he was reflecting on how when he got started, it was such a white space, and how that has shifted over the last 20 years. And I'm wondering, your perspective is kind of interesting too, because started in Kamloops. Have you seen that shift also? And I think Kareem's observation, which was really interesting, was how the shift has happened more with the electeds, and we're still lagging a bit on the staffer side. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I've always thought it was as important to get people involved in the back rooms of politics as it is the front rooms, right? Very, very important to have people see in the legislature, faces in the legislature that reflect who they are in the community. And I think people have to see themselves to, aspire to be that. So I think it's really important on the political side that we do work on that. And I think a lot of it is just lifting the mystery out of what it is to do politics. So, in my times away from politics, I try to focus on things. After Carol James resigned, and I actually left politics for a number of years before John ran for leader. And I used that time to volunteer for the Canadian Women's Voters Congress and to run a BC campaign school, which was nonpartisan, or all partisan, as I like to say, because all parties were represented in that campaign school. And the folks who are on the executive were women from all political parties. And so we really tried to run the campaign school. And Linda Reid was wonderful, let us use the legislature to actually run our training programs. And this idea that if we had more women involved in politics from all parties, we could get more women just involved in politics. And I think that was a real piece of it. And I took the lessons from that and the work and the volunteer work there to when I became executive director of the BC NDP, because so much of what I learned there and what stopped women from getting involved in politics is also what stops a lot of racialized people from getting involved in politics. So if you can lift the mystery a little bit about what happens when you get there, actually be in the room where you conduct business, I mean, I think it makes people feel like they can get involved. But I think all of us have to work harder to make things, more spaces, more accessible as well, right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be such a mystery, and you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions and to have that space where people can do that and learn. And I think it's good when you do it in a nonpartisan and all partisan environment, right? Because ultimately you're going to be in that house together, and you're going to have to find ways to build some consensus on the things that you really care about. And women working together is a wonderful way to do that across party lines. Sometimes we do it successfully, sometimes we don't. But certainly through my time in politics, women on both sides of the house have been incredibly supportive about things like a nonpartisan campaign school and about what they could do to help to get women there. I've always appreciated that.
The reality is that fewer women put their hands up to run in the first place, right? And so it's challenging. And from my perspective,
let me reframe that a bit, though, Mike. Right? It's like it's the problem of you don't have to ask a man to run. You have to ask a woman 7 times.
Oh, like, 100%. The men got their hands up.
Yeah.
And I've worked hard recruiting candidates over the years and understand how difficult it is, at least from a recruiting perspective, to do that. So for the NDP, and maybe this happened under your time as executive director, the equity policy came in that kind of, gave an advantage to basically non-white males to get nominations within the NDP. Was that kind of under your watch when that was brought in, Raj?
Well, I mean, there's been,
or implemented during that time. Yeah.
It was, it started to, if I think back to like when it became a conversation very earnestly within the party, was probably, 2009, 2010, as, and I think following the 2013 election, I think certainly the candidate recruitment after 2013 was very focused on diversifying our candidates. And, a lot of responsibility was given to constituency organizations to do the work, right? That people wouldn't just be, that you had to go show the work, that you talk to more people than the 3 people who had expressed interest in running for the nomination for the last 10 years. Did you reach out to community members? Did you reach out to immigrant service organizations and see who else is doing the work in the community that may not know that the NDP is recruiting for candidates, and that, if you're considering that, it's worth considering, and that there would be people who would talk you through what the process is. Because for most ordinary people, even if you think you can make a difference and you want to run in politics, it's daunting to get started and the process. So if you could work with your constituency associations and make it a real project to make sure that before you start the nomination process, that you have in fact done a search, right? And that was it, that you had to search, that you had to have conversations, and you had to show that you had these conversations and provide some feedback from those conversations, right? That it couldn't be, okay, it's done, Bob's running, it's happening, we have a candidate,
beyond that,
right?
It goes beyond that too, right? Like if an incumbent is not running again, then a diverse candidate has to follow now. Is that right?
So it's the other way. So if an incumbent is not seeking re-election,
right,
then then there is this frame of the diversity lens that goes on that, because ultimately the party policy was to have more diversity, and obviously in the seats where you're more likely to elect a New Democrat, then if you have a candidate that, represents more diversity, then they're more likely to get elected, right? So it wasn't, it's just that people were intimidated about running in those situations. And then seeing that there was a party that was genuinely interested in making this process easier for candidates who are interested, and that there was support for that. I think that made a huge difference. It's not perfect, and certainly parts of it have been controversial over the years, but I think most members of the party, when they see the diversity in the House, are very proud of the work that they've done to get there, and I think are very anxious to keep it up. And having as many women in the caucus as men is a huge goal for a lot of caucuses to get there, and to have actually gotten there. And then what do you do to make sure that diversity stays? And what are you doing every day to encourage more people to run and keep your party open and wide enough that people see themselves in it? I think that's the challenge.
Reading your bio, I was actually reflecting on your involvement in the gender balanced cabinet in BC, and just reflecting, like, how many gender balanced cabinets do we have in Canada? Like, I know we have one federally, I know we have one in BC. Is that it? Like, is that, wow. It's interesting to think too, because I think, I feel like I'm going to try and have an episode of this podcast where I don't mention childcare. It might be a bit of work, but I'm going to say it's interesting because federally, I think the consensus is certainly among the childcare movement that gender balance was really critical to the federal government being able to move finally on childcare. And I think it's not a coincidence that here back in BC, the first mover on this policy piece also had a gender balance cabinet. I mean, I'll turn that into a question, Raj. So I'm not just pontificating about childcare. What have you seen anything, over time that you see as a reflection of, kind of policy implications of gender balance and representation around the cabinet table?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and why have people fight so hard for gender balanced cabinets is because historically that's been shown. It's been shown in Europe and other places that when you do get, the mass amount of women involved in politics, changes do happen on things like childcare, on things that impact women later in life, pensions, right? That there's a broader look at these things, and having women at the table means that more of these things get implemented. I think that, and that's been the example from around the world. And women in the New Democratic Party, I mean, when I think about Rosemary Brown and everyone else, I mean, this is just, the women in the New Democratic Party have led the way on so many things. And so when this became a real issue in the party about whether we were electing enough women to caucus, there are people who really ran with that. And, for several conventions in a row, it was the main topic of our convention, how we were going to do that. And I think over the last decade, people have worked very hard to instill those changes so that they're pragmatic and practical and people can see a path forward.
Well, let me throw a trick question at you then. Do you think the equity policy should apply to leadership? Because, I mean, you've got 3 white males in a row leading the NDP. Is that taking it too far in your opinion, or do you think that's a conversation that's worth having in the NDP?
Well, I mean, I think, the conversation always happens in the NDP. I mean, when you have a leadership race, the first question is, okay, well, so who's going to run, right? Who's going to be the woman that runs? And I think I've turned that conversation a bit on the head. Well, what, if you're going to ask a woman to run, like, what have you done to change the landscape, which will make it easier for a woman to be leader than it was, say, for Carol James? I really appreciated the comments that John made about and I was working for Carol in her office at that time, and it was tough, right? And so I think, and it was a tough time in our caucus, and I think we learned a lot of lessons as a party from that. And I think people are less willing to throw a woman into the mix just because she's a woman. I think people want to know what we're going to do to support a woman that's going to be different this time than last time, right? And politics has changed immensely since Carol's been leader. The caucus has changed immensely. So I absolutely do hope that we have a woman leader running for the NDP. I mean, I think Premier Eby, probably has this for the next few rounds. But I think the conversation will definitely be different. But we're a few years away from that.
Yeah. Well, having been chief of staff to Christie, I can certainly attest to the fact there's women are held to a different standard in politics, and unfairly, and comes with a whole set of challenges that aren't there for men. But let me switch gears though to the NDP convention coming up this weekend. And you've been to probably quite a lot of NDP conventions in the past. And from outside, it looks like it's a weekend-long dour policy discussion of people going through 89 different policy resolutions and debating should we go back to our original principles or whatever. I don't know. What is it like at NDP convention? What goes on there? Do you guys have fun? Like, is it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think all political parties have fun at their convention. It is a wonderful opportunity to see people from all over the province. You don't, and this will be the first one since the pandemic. So I think
Mhm.
it will be quite a party, a celebration of Premier Eby's leadership. It'll be his first convention as leader, so his first convention speech. Of course, there'll be a leadership vote. I think it's on Saturday afternoon, right, where the party um, does a vote on the leader.
Does that happen
So
every convention?
it does happen every convention. Yeah.
Okay. And they're every 2
Mhm.
years or every year or what's
So every 2 years is the current convention, and then the off year
okay.
now the NDP has a huge training conference,
I see.
which I started taking to Kamloops. I noticed it got moved to the Okanagan last year, and so that's a way. Because the other thing about conventions, of course, is it's a wonderful opportunity to gather everybody. But if you're a new delegate, it's also a very intimidating time as well,
Yeah.
right? So one of the other things I really tried to do as party executive director was to do orientations for new delegates and like understand what happens on the floor, how you get to the mic, because you have to understand the process of how all this works to appreciate it as well. So to make people a bit more comfortable when they get there, so they can see themselves, because people come to convention, but not everybody gets to the mic. A lot of people go to the mic every time, and so how do you make your voice known? And so many opportunities to go to different caucus meetings, and where are you where you can cabinet ministers, right? It's a chance to all be together and really celebrate the work that we've done, and we're a year up from a campaign now, right? So there'll be
Mhm.
a lot of election talk and a lot of focus on that as well. And I was chatting with the party director this morning. So yes, I know that there are resolutions abound. I'm sure there'll be a challenge to the agenda when we start on Friday night. I mean, there's some very typical things you can expect at an NDP convention.
Well, so yeah, you've got all the ingredients for a great party, right? Like first time everyone's together since 2019. Things are looking good. You're out from an election. I'm wondering on the resolution piece, are there any kind of crunchy topics you see coming up?
Well, I mean, I think it's just going through. I mean, you'll have resolutions on climate. You'll have resolutions on SOGI. I mean, a lot of the NDP resolutions will be focused on the things that people have been focused on for the last few years. So, green jobs, climate action, democracy, human rights. Those are the main
Where are the
topics of the day.
within the NDP, and we talked about this with Premier Horgan,
Mhm.
keeping this voter coalition together of, from the NDP perspective, you'd like to be north of 45% of the popular vote, I'm sure. But that's a lot of people with different views inside of that. Where are the stress points in that coalition? Where are the areas that really have to be tended to in order to make sure it doesn't fracture?
Well, I mean, I think the New Democrats are incredibly passionate people, and so and I think issues around climate and the environment, which the NDP has been talking about since the '80s. I mean, those continue to be front and center. And the EB government and Minister Heyman, have an ambitious climate agenda, the most ambitious in North America. And I think for some people in the NDP, there's always got to be more. There's got to be more, right? This resolution doesn't go far enough. So I think that debate is still very much alive in the party about who we are as British Columbia and what our contributions can be to the climate debate, right? And where we're placed here and where we can best contribute. And those are ongoing conversations. And I think you'll see some of them at the convention this weekend.
Well, I want to pick up on that too, because I just, was reflecting on the leadership race for the NDP and Angelia Paderai's run for the leadership. That was interesting because she was backed by an environmentalist group. And I'm wondering, when you look back on that now with a bit of that kind of hindsight of time, How much do you see that maybe as something like a one-off, a sort of its own event, or maybe symptomatic of something bigger, of kind of the struggle of climate as an issue within the party?
I think, well, when it comes to NDP leadership races, I mean, they're always quite a busy affair. I mean, there's, typically, the party membership expands quite a bit during leadership races, and you get moved past the leadership, all political parties, and and then you get to a base membership. So, I mean, I don't think it was surprising, given that the NDP's in government, how much interest there was in the leadership race. I mean, I was quite surprised that someone so from the outside was interested, who had never been a member of caucus, who had never been involved in the party in any way, was interested in the top job. I think for a lot of New Democrats, that was like, wow, okay, well, this is exciting, but also like, who is this person? And so, do leadership races offer an opportunity for people to talk about issues? Absolutely. And I think, and that was an opportunity for the folks in that campaign to bring forward what they thought was the most important issue in British Columbia at the time. But I think people in the party and looking through the pandemic and just where we were, had different views of how to go forward. And I hope she stays involved in the party, but I don't know if she will. But it's a very strange way to encourage someone to get involved in politics at such a
Mhm.
high level without really being a part of it beforehand. I thought it was just an incredible stress to put on someone at that time. And I thought, she conducted herself as well as she could be in pretty trying circumstances, given the landscape that she was put in. So,
Well, there's not that, and
Mhm.
when it comes down to it, when a province of 5 million people, there's not that many people that belong to
Mm.
political parties as members. And I'm not sure what the current number in the NDP is. I think it's probably less than 50,000. BC United or its predecessor, BC Liberals, it goes up and down over the years depending on leadership races and things, but the active number of members isn't that high. So they are vulnerable to takeover and vulnerable to a large group coming in and kind of having its way. And as someone who was executive director of the NDP, I mean, what's the strength of grassroots politics these days? Like the member who year in and year out attends convention and goes to riding association meetings and is the lifeblood of it. Do you see it consistent with previous years, or do you see it on the decline?
um, I think from my experience in the NDP, it's just changed quite a bit. And I think part of it is this when we move to having a training conference outside of convention years. And this is so important because convention can be a very divisive place, especially if you're a new member just
Mm.
getting interested in politics. So where do you come together where you talk about the things you're going to do together? Whether it's canvassing or how you're going to run campaigns or how you're going to fundraise. So I looked at that training conference in the off years as an opportunity to bring people together who maybe policy wasn't the main thing that drove
Mm-hmm.
them. I mean, convention is very much about policy. So where do
Mm-hmm.
you go to the people who love to canvass, who love to fundraise, who
Mm-hmm.
like to do all these other things in politics that is not policy? And where do you give them a place to come together? So that was very exciting. And that refreshed our constituency associations, Mike. Because then you would have to find people who would like to go to the
Mm-hmm.
training conference and not the policy conference. And that changed the dynamics. And then those people got involved in the constituency associations, right? So I see a much younger demographic in many of our constituency associations. Whereas for a good 30 years there, Mike, I could tell you everybody who was on the constituency association
Yeah.
and how they felt. And now, I go into conventions and stuff, and it's so great. There's a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually know personally. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an amazing growth that we've had over the last few years.
Right. Let me ask you about the next election.
Mhm.
How could the NDP lose the next election?
Campaigns matter, right? I mean, so I mean, they could lose it if they, ran a crappy campaign, I suppose.
Mhm.
That's one way. But listen, we're a year out. The elections are way closer in BC. at election time than they are a year out. I think there's a lot can happen in a year, and everyone should be prepared to take advantage of every opportunity, right? I mean, there's elections in BC are very, very hard fought. There's usually just a few percentage points separating us. I mean, there are many elections there with Carol James, right, where it was like 2 or 3 points. And it's hard when you lose elections that closely, but you learn a lot from that. So I think there is, Bob talked a little bit psychologically about where the party was, before John became leader in that 2017 campaign. So I think there is New Democrats want to win. There's been a culture shift around that. Mm-hmm. They've won, they like to win, they want to keep winning. So I think there'll be discipline in this campaign, as there have been for the last two, a discipline that perhaps wasn't always there in the elections previous to that. But I think over the last few years, there's been a real understanding that if you want to take all this policy and everything you do at convention and you actually want it to make a difference, well, then you have to focus on winning. And you have to get over the past battles, and you all have to pull together. And I think that has been very uplifting for people. And I think that will hold them in good stead over the coming year. And the premier's got very smart people around him, and I think they will run a good campaign, and they'll have lots of support from others. And so it'll be a very exciting year, and anything could happen. I will not make a prediction.
How would you like to see the NDP frame the ballot question?
I mean, I think it very much has to be focused on people, right? I mean, I think given where we are right now, the very big stresses people are feeling in their day-to-day lives. I live here in East Van, and it's stressful for people, and it's what you see on the streets, but it's also how you feel about your own household. So I think the ballot question has to be steeped in this recognition about where people are at, right? You've got to meet people where they're at and what they're thinking about, and the day-to-day things in their life and their household budget. And the ballot question has to be framed around that. Who's going to keep working for you on the things that matter to you and your household?
What do you think will be the number one issue for the campaign? I mean, it seems like today it's affordability, define affordability. Going into 2017 campaign, the housing crisis had just started. Now we're 7 years into it now, but do you see affordability going the distance as the key issue for the next election?
At this juncture, about a year out, Mike, yeah, I would certainly say I don't see the affordability piece taking a backseat over the next year, right? I mean, I just think we're not sure about where the rate hikes are still. There might be another one coming, I think, for the next year. And, and I've been even hearing reports over the last little while, things could get worse in 2024, right? Like, I mean, I don't think we're seeing the end of this period that we're in right now. And I think things will continue to be very tough. And I think on the housing front, things will continue to be tough. I mean, even if everything goes to the best of everyone's hope and ability about what can happen here with all this upzoning, there's a leg, right? People will be feeling the stress in between the legs. And rents are still going up here in Vancouver and across British Columbia. So I don't see all of that changing in huge ways between now and next summer.
We could have a rate cut and it would still be the issue. I'm not predicting a rate cut. I'm just saying that's where we're at. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Raj. It was really a pleasure perfect timing to kick off the convention this weekend and talking to you. And I hope you'll join us at Hotel Pacifico again. I think we'll have more to talk about in the near future.
We're opening up a new cowboy bar in the basement for all the Kamloops guests that come here. So
awesome!
Modeled after the Jack Daniels, I believe it was, downtown Kamloops. So
talking my language, Mike. Talking my language.
All right.
Oh, that's cowboy great. Bar. Okay. I'm always grateful when a speaker opens an event or gathering with an informed and thoughtful land acknowledgement. The thing many of us settlers seem to miss too often is that it's not just about naming whose territory you're on. When we take the time to learn more about the land, our connection to it, and the generations and generations of people who were here before us, we can learn a lot, not just about history, but the actions we can take today. That emphasis on action is what our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has strived to bring to their work on reconciliation. They were the first technology company in Canada to formalize this commitment through their Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan. The plan was built in full partnership with Indigenous peoples. It is their voices and input that guide it, and it adheres to Indigenous-led frameworks of reconciliation. There are 4 pillars. Connectivity, which is about collaborating with Indigenous governments to get communities connected to high-speed internet. Enabling social outcomes, which is about going beyond that connectivity to create programs that help communities achieve long-term prosperity. Cultural responsiveness and relationships are about listening, learning, and acting in ways that ensure culturally responsive experiences for Indigenous customers and team members. And finally, economic reconciliation, supporting sustainable economic participation and growth for Indigenous peoples through meaningful involvement in TELUS's business. These pillars have led to the expansion of networks to 11 communities throughout the Yale to Chawatil corridor along Highway 1. They've also led to partnerships that uphold Indigenous rights to self-determination. Partnerships like the first of its kind one that TELUS has formed with the Niska Lissam's government, which sees the nation owning and maintaining their network infrastructure with workforce development support from TELUS. You can learn more about it all at telus.com/reconciliation.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Lots to talk about again in the strategy suite this week. We have a clipping. Our clipping this week is from Fran Yenner in the Northern Beat. And actually, it takes a deeper look at actually what the government knew going into a committee meeting, I think going back to June 2022, that they actually were aware of what DULF was doing in terms of procuring illicit drugs, verifying them for safety, and then using them as safe supply. There was an interesting exchange about this actually in the legislature this week. Mike, I'm wondering, did you see that exchange with AG Sharma and Mike DeYoung?
Yeah, there was a bit of a feisty exchange, and Mike DeYoung, the old crafty veteran of the legislature, had a pretty,
nobody does indignation better.
Yeah, he is a great parliamentarian, and he managed to draw out the drama of it. But basically, the issue was, what did she know and when did she know it? And Mike DeYoung picked up on the reporting that had happened. That may not be old news to people who were involved at the legislature in terms of those who were sitting on standing committees when these things were discussed, both government and opposition members, but it was new to a lot of people outside of the bubble. So the opposition had an issue on it. And just on the clipping of the week, Northern Beat, what's that, right?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting example of where you have a fledgling news service that's been around, I don't know, for a year or so, that broke some news. And that's kind of going against the narrative that the press gallery is declining, that here's a kind of a nimble news service that's doing new stuff. So I just shout out to them for that. But yeah, that's so my bringing it back to the issue. I'm just wondering politically, is this a real issue? Is it a sideshow? Like, where's this going?
I think, Mike,
Geoff, what do you think?
Well, if you spin it one way, it's an issue. Spun another way, it's not. That's politics in life. I mean, the hearing in question was one an all-party committee set up largely because the government accepted the challenge. Horgan accepted the challenge in question period from the opposition bench to do a deeper dive on safer supply, the opioid crisis. And their recommendations included an all-party recommendation to look for safer supply under a prescription model. Deep involvement by the Liberal people there, including the BC Liberals at the time, now BC United, but Shirley Bond, who's hard to pull the wool over her eyes, and she's certainly needs no help on the assertiveness front. So I think part of the frustration on the NDP side was, look, you were there, you heard the testimony that indicated these people were doing these things, but you weren't offended then, but you are now, which is true. However, now the BC United Front Bench, especially on our Sturco, have decided to style this as taking government money, which was a pretty unclear part of the discussion last year, to buy drugs on the dark web, which they then test to see if they're safe, and then they provide them to a very, very small number of addicts. So it's a difficult one for the government because Sturco can make statements that are not false, but probably misleading, and suggest that the government somehow has been participating with funneling money through the Drug Users Liberation Front to organized crime, meaning the dark web. But the bottom line of all of this, I think, is that opioids are going to be at least a second-tier question, and the overdose crisis in the upcoming campaign, as they should be when it's the leading cause of death now in every age category. How the two parties or three parties or four parties decide to fight it out will be very interesting to see, because you can see that David Eby's team are moving more to respond to public concern by reining in decriminalization, for example. So
it is a basket of issues, right?
Yeah.
That's with tentacles, and this is one aspect of it. Street crime's another, mental health's another. So, government may try to address that holistically. That's probably what they're trying to do. But at the same time, the voters may be looking at it holistically, like it's all related, and we don't like where it's going. And that's a tricky part of it for the government.
Yeah, I think that the deteriorating feeling in the province about right track, wrong track, which I was going to mention later, reflects some of that reality. It's hard to walk around in any town now in BC and think things are really looking up because of the difficulties, especially on the homeless front.
Well, I wanted to bring this back too to the discussion we had a couple of weeks now on SOS and the coalition of businesses who've come together to say, like, this has gone too far, something has to happen. And again, I think one of the things we observed, like sort of saying that and saying government needs to act on the opioid crisis and street crime without really pointing to like what that is. I think since then we've seen Just Ketchum come out and say that the coalition's actually going to have some KPIs they're going to track, which I think is really interesting, right? Like they're going to have some KPIs they're going to track, and they're going to keep the pressure on the government to move on this topic. But like bringing it back to this issue, it's a really tough one because it's kind of saying, like, I mean, Dolph as an example is something that has a track record and data-backed success rates in improving outcomes for people struggling with addiction. But it points to how dicey this subject can be. And I think you, Geoff, said it's kind of depending on how you spin it, how it can be hard to act in some of these places, because if the legacy of this for the government is funding the illicit drug trade, it becomes really hard for them to act in the safe supply space.
Well, I think there was just before we move on, Mike, that what surprised me about the SOS thing was not how it played out, because it was a very conventional, understandable, but conventional political play where key people who had a lot of background in the area decided to contribute their pro bono work and so on and so forth. And so coalitions put together, it has demands, it wants KPIs. But the police had a sweep almost immediately, coordinated across the Lower Mainland, that arrested a surprising number of shoplifters, apparently. And this gets back to a point that I made, I think, on a previous podcast, which is that it's not possible for the Premier or the Solicitor General to phone up any police officer, no matter where they sit in the system, and say, I'd like you to crack down on shoplifting. That's political interference, can't be done, kind of thing. So this was a very interesting and very timely reaction by the police on a coordinated basis that we haven't seen before, and it'd be interesting to see if that happens further and how it's being developed, and whether it makes a change.
But in terms of the the SOS coalition, and I think you said a conventional approach, it is a bit old school, where you bring together businesses and have a press conference and make an announcement. And I find that kind of interesting in a way, where you got Just Ketchum, who's for those who don't know, is a guy with a ton of political experience for decades in British Columbia, very well respected. And it's maybe this is old school organizing, whereas these days it's like, hey, you put out a few tweets and have a website, and that's protest. But this is maybe actually creating a coalition of people that are concerned about these issues throughout the province. And if I'm a average homeowner in, say, Coquitlam, and who who am I going to listen to, the London Drugs guy or the Drug User Liberation Front? You know, so I think there is a bit of that too, as to where do I attach myself to the points of views that are coming out here.
Yeah,
So
and
I know
I
it's
don't
more
think
complicated than that, but it's, you know,
I think the branding of the Drug User Liberation Front is problematic for the government. I'll just say that.
yeah.
You know,
So
difficult.
to be continued. To be continued.
Come back to this one. Well, then we do want to just take a minute, I think, and come back to the discussion we had with Raj, and looking ahead to the NDP convention happening this weekend. Geoff, just to you, I'm wondering what you're thinking the focus might be there this weekend.
Well, I think that the focus will be on some of the tremendous work that's been done over the last year, and the delegates, as Raj said earlier, will be very happy and excited to get together and to talk about the possibility of an election, particularly starting at this point. But we've been here before, and Mike ruined that party with his Christy Clark leadership work and all of the kind of efforts that went into stopping the NDP train in 2013. So there will be that underlying anxiety. I think there'll be debate about fracking, probably. Some kind of LNG issue. Raj pointed to that. There are apparently a number of resolutions about SOGI, because that was current at the time the deadline was coming for the resolutions. There'll be undoubtedly a resolution of some kind about the situation in the Middle East, probably calling for a ceasefire, which is the NDP position, but that would be an emergency resolution of some kind. And it'll be passionate. I don't know how,
that would
divisive
be
it'll
very
be.
divisive. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. So I think all of those are likely to play a role. I don't think that David Eby will have any issue with regard to his leadership review. Horgan, you'll recall, was at 97% in 2017. That was like a sort of a Soviet-style approval at that convention. But it started to.
Not sure even Stalin got 97%.
It started to. By the time we got to the last one, which was virtual, I think he was down to 83% or something like that. So people will see how that plays out. But it'll be good,
7 years, well, at least this year, 6 years into government, but next election, 7 years into government. Like, what's your assessment of the hunger level? Because usually, I mean, I'm sure, gosh, you guys must have been ravenous in 2017, wanting to get into government. But as time goes on, people start getting comfortable. Like,
well,
where do you think the party's at on that?
There's, I was going to save this for the mini bar, and I will probably use it in the mini bar. But there's a real danger of complacency, and I think Raj made some important qualifications in her comments about the need to be careful a year out. I mean, the problem facing most people, and Horgan was excellent, of course, at focusing on people, is that they don't feel good economically. And the polling continues to show anxiety about healthcare. And these are very, very difficult issues. So I think, care has to be taken there on those two fronts. There's no room for complacency. And the candidate search work will be very interesting as well, because I think there are a lot of very strong new faces that Premier be put into cabinet, and he may shuffle the cabinet again if he feels that there's some people who aren't running, and their vacancies can be created for new faces even before the coming campaign. So I think it'll be an interesting time, probably quiet. I think there's all signs are that it'll be quiet. And having said so, maybe I've made it impossible, but they're expecting about 800 delegates, and I think a good time will be had by all. And then there's a lot of thinking for the leadership, Premier Eby and his team and cabinet, as they prepare for the next budget. This is a crucial time for them.
How much management is there from the center of these conventions? Like, is it let it breathe, let the delegates go out there, or are you white knuckling a bit?
My experience was we were, in the Premier's office. He's the leader. You're closely tied into the management of the convention, but the party manages the convention, and it takes care of all of the arrangements, of course, but also is working closely with all the committees about what comes forward for debate, how the debates are handled, and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of effort goes into making sure that it's a successful convention. And one of the time-honored aspects of NDP conventions that means they'll never make primetime television if television continues to exist is that there's a lot of points of order and candidate participation in ways that really aren't about political debate. And those can be pretty fractious as well. People trying to change the agenda, trying to move forward, intervene in the convention process to get something debated that might not otherwise be debated. Those can eat up a lot of time. So but it'll be very interesting to see how also Premier Eby sets the stage in his own speech, because he's been doing a very successful round of speeches, but tending to do more fireside chat kinds of things, which we saw at the UBCM, where he spoke briefly and then did the sit down piece. So NDP convention delegates have tended to like the barn burner. They like to see the old school, podium thumping thing. They like to do standing ovations. But maybe he'll set a different tone, as he has in many other ways. We'll just have to see how he wants to go.
He did it for the federal NDP. He did more of the, the podium barn burner thing. But I would agree.
He's not a creature of the party, though.
Yeah.
Well, he's been doing a lot of work around on his recent swing back east. He spoke to a gathering of Nova Scotia Democrats. He made time in his agenda in Vancouver to go to the book launch of Ed Broadbent's new book about social democracy. So I think he's been tending to a lot of that stuff. You're right. He was, as an activist, was in civil rights and Pivot Legal, but has spent a lot of time in party circles since then. So I think he'll, and getting out on the road a lot. He's traveled a lot.
Well, and you're going to be there next week, right? Or this weekend, right, Geoff?
I am.
So you're going to tell us all about it next week.
Yeah. No, well, we should do an extra show. It'll be fantastic.
I won't be there.
We'll be sure to ask you all about not being there next week, Mike.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm sorry, I don't know. This is kind of fresh or breaking, and I just find it so delightful. I want to raise a glass, and I'm wondering if both of you saw this. I want to raise a glass to New Westminster, which featured on The Price is Right. Please tell me if you saw that. Okay, so
no, big news.
It's big news, and it's amazing. Because if you watch the clip of The Price is Right, they sort of do this, you'll win a prize to Canada, which raises so many questions, where in Canada? Is he going to go to Quebec City and eat maple syrup popsicles with Bonhomme? Is he going to go to Churchill? Is he going to where is he going, to the Rockies? No, he's going to go to New Westminster to stay at a hotel there. And I have to say, the footage of New Westminster looks fantastic. But one of the funny things about it was the contestant overestimated the price of this cost, almost by double. And the observations from the host and everyone else was, wow, it's really affordable to take a holiday in New West. So cheers to New West for looking
City.
Yeah, cheers to New West for looking great on The Price is Right and being finally, an affordable holiday.
Reaching its destiny.
Well, I have to say, if you can get a room in New West, which looks over the Fraser River down to Mount Baker, it's a pretty special view.
Exactly. That's the footage of it, right? And the key, and it looked great. Good. Cheers to them.
Good. Do you want me? I'll go next.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of toasted already, but my toast is to David Eby as he comes up to his first anniversary as Premier. He's worked really hard, brought a lot of stuff into the House. But before we order a second round and really get into it, I would just caution that there's always danger when the public is anxious about issues that you've typically been good at managing. And I would say healthcare is one of those. And of course, the economy and affordability are the other. So as the year gets to an end and he starts preparing for the next year in the campaign, I would just urge him to look carefully at the problems that British Columbians are perceiving in the healthcare system in particular, and see if there isn't more that can be done to shore up their confidence in that, because they certainly look to a leader like him to be strong on that front. And currently there's a lot of anxiety. So congratulations on a job well done, and careful about the next round.
I will raise a glass to Gordon Gibson Jr., who passed away this past week. Gordon was the leader of the BC Liberal Party from about 1974 to 1979, MLA in the House, solitary Liberal for a number of years, where he earnestly gave great policy speeches to be ignored by both the other parties. But his legacy is more than that. He was a very well-respected thinker on Western Canada and BC's place in Canada, and was always close to the public process, whether he was a commentator or in a capacity. I think he was also at Pierre Trudeau's wedding, well, in 70, which is a trivia footnote. Gordon Gibson was in a lot of different places, but condolences to Jane, and those who knew Gordon knew what a tremendous impact he made on the
Well,
province.
Mike, didn't he contest a leadership race in which all three candidates were named Gordon?
The top three candidates were named Gordon Campbell, Gordon Gibson, Gordon Wilson. That's right, 1993.
Race to the Gordons.
Good.
Raised glasses all around today at Hotel Pacifico.
Yeah.
Well, thanks
we're
to
not good at taking
Raj.
shots.
You guys just want to stay in the minibar. I think Horgan is gone. I think he finally left. So we got a big cleanup job there. But thank you, Raj Sihota, for joining us today at Hotel Pacifico. And thanks to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for making this happen. Look forward to seeing all our visitors next week back at the hotel.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.